That doesn't even count insurance, maintenance, or the cost of the car. American families are in desperate need of help this summer. Today we will begin the first in a series of 3 hearings that the Select Committee will conduct over the next 2 weeks to examine the Democratic New Direction Energy Plan that will not only provide consumers with immediate relief from skyrocketing energy prices, but also to provide long-term solutions that will reduce our energy dependence and help our economy. The Bush administration continues to oppose Democratic proposals that will provide consumers with relief right now and put us on a path to a renewable energy future in the long run. Our nation's Strategic Petroleum Reserve currently contains more than 706 million barrels of oil and is filled to over 97% of its capacity, the highest level in its history. More than 2 weeks ago, Speaker Pelosi called on President Bush to take action to immediately lower oil prices by deploying oil from this reserve. Each day that passes without the Bush administration taking action is another day that American families and our economy fall deeper into crisis. We cannot afford to wait any longer. Deploying oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve has driven down prices when it has been used in the past. In 1991, when President Bush's father deployed oil from the reserve, oil prices fell 33.4%. In 2000, President Clinton conducted a time exchange of oil from the SPR, and prices again immediately dropped by 18.7%. And in 2005, when President Bush himself released oil following Hurricane Katrina, prices fell 9.1%. That's an average drop in the price of oil of 19.2%. If we experienced a similar impact now, it would mean a $25 reduction in the price of oil. But President Bush and Republican leaders in Congress continue to oppose releasing oil to help consumers. Instead, President Bush proposes giving away our nation's beaches and wilderness areas to big oil. The Bush administration's own Energy Department has stated that drilling off our coast and in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge will not produce any oil for 10 years and will have an insignificant impact on prices 20 years from now. So all that President Bush, Vice President Cheney, and other Republican leaders in Washington have to offer to consumers who are being shaken down at the pump on a daily basis are the same tired drilling schemes that won't provide any relief whatsoever for 10 to 20 years. That is the agenda of the American Petroleum Institute, not the American people. In contrast, Democrats in Congress want to provide American families with help in the next 10 to 20 days by deploying our nation's oil reserve. While President Bush is willing to deploy our National Guard reserves to protect oil fields abroad, he continues to refuse to deploy our Strategic Petroleum Reserve to protect American consumers here at home. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve is a powerful weapon that the American people have against big oil, OPEC, and the speculators and manipulators that are driving up prices. And it is time for President Bush to use it. Let me now stop and turn to recognize the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Schreck, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll insert my opening statement in the record. However, I will make a couple of quick comments. First of all, I want to welcome our witnesses. I particularly want to help Mr. May, who, as I know, working aggressively to help the airline industry. My hometown is the base of an important airline in this nation, and I know that the airlines have been crushed by the sudden spike in fuel prices. I really hadn't intended to get partisan in this discussion. However, listening to you, Mr. Chairman, I feel somewhat compelled to do so. Certainly, I believe the SPRO is one possible avenue. I voted for not putting any more oil into it earlier this year. I think acknowledging that either not putting more oil into the Strategic Petroleum Reserve or taking some oil out of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve is an intellectual acknowledgement that increasing supply will have an effect on prices. Indeed, that there is a link between supply and prices. And you say the President is not willing to release oil from the SPRO, and therefore that's damaging. I would turn the tables on you and say, regrettably, your party is unwilling to do anything about supply other than the SPRO. And I would note that in the testimony of one of our witnesses, when the President earlier last week, I believe on Monday or Tuesday, announced that he was willing to open the Outer Continental Shelf, which we have put off limits. And we put off limits back when gasoline prices were $1.30 or $1.40 a gallon. We continue to keep it off limits from any further production or exploration now that gasoline is $4.12 a gallon. But when the President lifted the executive branch limit restriction on Outer Continental Shelf drilling, there was a drop of $6.48 in the price of a barrel of oil on the very next day, the single largest drop in the price of oil in any one day since 1991. I don't think this is an issue on which we ought to be partisan. I think this is an issue on which we need to be very concerned about American consumers, particularly about those consumers who are in the worst financial position, the people who drive the oldest cars because they can't afford newer, more efficient cars, the people who live the furthest from work because they can't afford to live near where they work. And quite frankly, we need to be deeply concerned about the American economy. It does not serve this nation for us as politicians to be throwing partisan shots back and forth at each other while American businesses, for example, the American airline business, are suffering when they have to compete with foreign competitors. The weak dollar is an issue in this debate. Some people believe speculation is an issue in this debate, and I think anybody with any rationality understands that the tight situation between supply and demand is a part of this problem. If we don't address at least every conceivable aspect of this issue and do everything we can, we're not serving the American people well. For that reason, I do commend you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing and look forward to the testimony of our witnesses.
Great. Gentleman's time has expired. The Chair recognizes the gentlelady from California, Ms. Solis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for having this hearing, and I thank the witnesses for being here. I just want to recall that the other day, while I was being interviewed by Fox News, they asked me, the anchor person asked me if there was really a crisis going on and if we should really be dipping into the SPRO. And I said, when is it not a crisis when our people have to pay $4.60 or more a gallon and people are losing their businesses? And I'm talking about people from a district like mine where we've seen prices as high as $4 for the last 8 months, and we see no relief. And we find that a good number of them, a good proportion, are spending about 12% of their income just on transportation. Many who are transit dependent, but many who are driving older cars. This crisis did not come upon us because of Democrats taking over the House a year ago. This came about because of our lack of investment in renewable energies. And yesterday, I had the opportunity to hear Mr. T-Bone Pickens talk about renewable sources, and I was quite surprised to hear what he had to say. Very enlightened, in fact, that these are other issues that we need to be focusing in on. It can't just be about oil dependency, and I think the public and even people from districts like mine get it. They know that we have to change our course, and we are large consumers of fossil fuels, and we need to change that. And we do care about our planet and the climatic action that's going on. We see a hurricane that's going to hit right now in Mexico and Texas. It's further going to, I think, erode our ability to obtain more fossil fuel there. But I think we need to be looking and investing in other alternatives, and that's what the new direction in Congress is looking at. So I thank our witnesses and look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.
Great. Gentlelady's time has expired. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Blumenauer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity for us to explore with our witnesses the implications of deploying the Strategic Petroleum Reserve now. Given in the course of the last year, we have essentially doubled the price of a barrel of oil on the world market. There's been, what, a 2% increase in world demand. There's something else going on here. I seriously doubt that the prospect of some oil supply 20 years from now on the outer shelf or someplace else in the United States was responsible for a reduction of $6 a barrel. I think the fact that we have been having serious discussion with Speaker Pelosi and others, including yourself, Mr. Chairman, about the wisdom of the redeployment of a small amount of this oil to signal where we're going, and the fact that over the course of the next 2 or 3 months, there could be deployment of a small amount of that reserve, but disrupting some of the strategies of people who would manipulate the market, I think is very, very important. And I appreciate your leadership and that of the Speaker zeroing in on this. I look forward to exploring further with our witnesses. I think this is part of a multifaceted approach in the short term to try and squeeze the speculative bubble, because there's clearly, whether it's $10 a barrel or $70 a barrel, I don't know. The witnesses we've heard before this committee and others have not been in agreement, but there's clear that that is part of the issue. Put in place with a comprehensive approach to energy, broadening our sources wherever they are, and not being reliant on a fossil fuel, petroleum-based economy. I welcome the call from the former Vice President about setting our sights high. It's something you and the Speaker have been doing. I look forward to exploring these elements with our witnesses in a few moments. Thank you very much.
Thank the gentleman. The Chair recognizes the gentlelady from Tennessee, Ms. Blackburn.
Well, I'm not, is this on? Yeah, it is on. Okay, the little button's not working. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank you for the hearing, and our witnesses, I thank you very much for being with us today. We are looking forward to visiting with you and hearing what you have to say on the issue and on the release of the portion of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, should that be undertaken. But I will tell you, that is an action that I do not support. I don't think that oil should be taken out of the SPR unless there is a genuine emergency where supplies have been cut off. And I think the situation that we face with instability in the Middle East shows us that an SPR release would not be the wisest move that we could make at this point. I think this issue is very different than when Congress passed a bill with my support to stop filling the SPR. This brought more oil supply to the market. It did not significantly affect our emergency supply, and it provided temporary immediate relief to the American consumer. But what really is behind this initiative is, I think, the failure of the majority's leadership to have a comprehensive or a rational energy policy. And they're not listening to what my constituents and certainly what most Americans are saying and what they are demanding of us when it comes to energy policy. They want us, the American people want us to get to work on this and to do something that is going to affect long term. They want us to drill here, drill now. They want to end up paying less. So I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say today, and I appreciate the fact that we are having the hearing to approach the issue. I yield back.
Great. Gentlelady's time has expired. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Washington State, Mr. Inslee.
I'd just like to say I think a small release from the SPRO is entirely appropriate, but I want to respond to this sort of continuum canard that somehow Democrats aren't for increasing supply of energy. In fact, we're for an increasing supply of energy as proposed by famous Republican T-Bone Pickens, who addressed our caucus yesterday and said we got enormous amounts of energy blowing in the wind. A fellow who just invested $4 billion of building the world's largest wind turbine farm in Texas. What Democrats are for is to really expand our source of energy, but not just in oil. And we're seeing the DOE that's told us we can have 20% of our electricity from electricity that can power our cars. And this is the great vision that Democrats have of powering our cars with electricity, either through the use of lithium-ion batteries or through, as T-Bone Pickens has suggested, displacing it and use natural gas for cars rather than residential. You can argue about which one is going to win the race, natural gas or lithium-ion batteries, but Democrats are providing a vision for more energy. We know there is not enough energy off of our coastline to make an appreciable difference in the price of fuel because it's less than 0.5% of world oil supplies. But we also know that we are blessed with enormous supplies of energy in wind, in our water, in our sunshine, in our engineered geothermal, and these are the sources of energy that finally can break the slavery that we now are suffering under to oil. And the only way to break slavery in these chains of this addiction to provide new sources of energy that are not oil. We are for increasing supply in the places where we can really make a difference, and we're going to get that job done. Thanks.
Great. The gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. McNerney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today's hearing is both timely and important. I believe that the Strategic Petroleum Reserve is the exact right tool to go after speculators and to make sure that the market is being controlled in a strategic way. We don't need to use very much of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, small amounts, 5 million barrels once a week or once a month should discourage speculation. But I want to hear it from the experts to understand what you think is possible and how you think that will affect the market, and if you think that that will discourage speculation, and if so, how, and if not, what can we do to make sure that it does. So I welcome your testimony. In my district, we've seen some of the highest prices of gasoline in the nation. People are definitely hurting. In fact, I have to drive over a very large district, so I feel the pain from high price of gasoline. So we all want to find a solution. I don't think it enhances the problem by pointing fingers at each other, but it does enhance it by discussing rationally what the future will look like, how we can use the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, and what other long-term objectives we need to go after. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Great. Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Hall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would echo Mr. Inslee's remarks and say I personally am I don't own any drilling equipment, but I'm not stopping anybody from drilling. In fact, I'd be very happy if the oil companies would drill on the 68 million acres they've already leased and permitted in the lower 48 and adjacent offshore plots. But that can't be and won't be the long-term solution because we just don't have, and in fact, the world will not have enough oil to last forever. In New York this morning, gas prices are averaging $4.27, in some places $4.50. Like the rest of the country, they have been high for weeks. And in the last week, as the price of crude fell, the price of gasoline at the pump continued to climb, once again showing the disconnect that I think should be looked into by the CFC, Consumer Products Trading Commission. In an area like ours, where commuting is not so much a lifestyle choice as it is a necessity, this is an economic squeeze for families that are already being squeezed by higher consumer costs. We didn't dig our way into this hole overnight, and we need to keep pushing the visionary new solutions that this committee and this Congress have tried to advance. President Bush has often alluded to the fact that he can't simply wave a magic wand to make gas prices go down. But in fact, he does have a magic wand to give us some slack immediately, the SPR. A release of oil from the SPR is a tested, proven, secure, and effective method of calming markets and lowering prices. The last 3 presidents have successfully used SPR oil to head off serious economic damage and dangerous record spikes. I would also note that the oil in the SPR has been put there through the Royalty in Kind program for exploration on public lands, meaning that the oil in the SPR is the American people's oil, and the administration should use it to help them now. Today, I look forward to hearing from our panelists about the best way to do just that, and I yield back.
Great. Gentleman's time has expired, and all time for opening statements has been completed. We'll now turn to our first witness, Mr. Kyle Simpson, who is currently the Policy Director for Brownstein, Hyatt, Farber, and Schreck. Mr. Simpson has formerly served in a number of positions at the Department of Energy, including Associate Deputy Secretary of Energy and Senior Policy Advisor to the Secretary. In those roles, Mr. Simpson's responsibilities included policy development and direction for the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. We thank you for being here today, Mr. Simpson. Whenever you are ready, please begin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning to the members of the committee, and thank you for asking me to appear here today. The history of market reaction to releases of crude oil from the reserve shows that strategically deploying oil from the SPR is good public policy and can have an immediate beneficial impact on crude oil, gasoline, and other petroleum product prices. SPR experience also shows that the downturn of gasoline and other prices is apt to occur with the mere announcement or anticipation of an announcement of a release. I will focus on some of the details of the results of the actions taken by the Reserve, including the release of oil before the first Gulf War, the announcement of the sale in 1996, the 2000 exchange of oil, and the announcement of a release after Hurricane Katrina in 2005. Each of these releases from the Reserve are good examples of the implications that can be the result of a release. They provide insights into the results of actions by the Reserve in response to real, anticipated, or perceived oil, and in some cases product supply shortages, or to send messages to overly heated markets that the U.S. government is prepared to use the Reserve to protect consumers. The sale of oil from the SPR in concert with the first Gulf War was announced on January 16, 1991 in anticipation of the impending conflict. The disruption on which the finding was based had not actually occurred. In the face of impending military conflict, the administration utilized the SPR's anticipatory authorities for the drawdown. On January 17th, the price of oil fell from $32.25 to $21.48 and stabilized. In the Omnibus Appropriations Act for 1996, the Congress directed DOE to sell $227 million worth of oil to achieve the overall budget target for the year. At that time, retail gasoline prices were climbing. Shortly after the law was enacted, President Clinton implemented the sale of approximately 12 million barrels from the SPR. The decision to sell the oil immediately resulted in a downturn in gasoline prices on April 29 and 30 that continued through the first week of October of that year. The principal impact of the announced sale was psychological, temporarily halting the bullish pressures in the market, and led to a reversal in both crude and product prices. Selling oil is not the only way the SPR can be used to help alleviate price problems. In 2000, home heating oil inventories were extremely low, and President Clinton gave then-Secretary Bill Richardson the authority to exchange 30 million barrels from the SPR to the market. As a result, as the Chairman pointed out in his opening statement, oil prices dropped 34% by the end of the year, going from $30.94 to $20.38 per barrel. After Hurricane Katrina, prices began to rise very dramatically because of disruptions in productive capacity in the Gulf. On September 2, 2005, President George W. Bush issued a finding of severe energy supply interruption and directed the Secretary to withdraw and sell oil from the Reserve. The announcement after the announcement, and that in each of these cases it's the announcement that causes the price to change. The actual movement of oil occurs weeks later. The price dropped from $69.50 to $66.91 the next day and continued a steady decline for several months. The price did not exceed the peak until April of 2006. At that point, the refilling of the Reserve was suspended for another year. It's difficult to know the exact impact of a release, but as these releases indicate, the psychological impact and the fact that more oil is going into the market has caused the price to go down for extended periods of time. It has to be a substantial amount of a release in order to have that effect, but I think some of the proposals that are being considered today or by the Congress would be substantial. I also want to point out that you have a unique opportunity to utilize the SPR to address the current energy crisis in a way that can add to significant funding for new alternative energy, clean energy for the future. If you took the GAO's advice to release oil, light oil from the Reserve, which is all it contains right now, in contrast to the some 40% of heavy oil that our refining industry uses today, and did an exchange over time and allowed the Department to make decisions as to when that oil would be released and when it would be brought back, the price differential that GAO has estimated is about $12 a barrel between light and heavy oil. If you monetized that differential over the 70 million barrels, you could bring in more than $800 million into the government that is not anticipated under the current budget, and use that for many purposes, but one that I would suggest would be as a down payment on the next generation of clean domestic energy resources. I see that I'm about to have run out of time, so I would just want to point that out and make those suggestions. I hope the history of the reserve has been helpful, and I thank you for asking me to come today.
Thank you, Mr. Simpson, very much. Our next witness is Dr. Joe Rome, who is a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress. He also served in the Department of Energy in a number of capacities, including acting Assistant Secretary and Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy. He has written extensively on the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. We welcome you, Dr. Rome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I have three main points. First, we tried offshore drilling in 2006 and oil prices doubled. Second, the only plausible remaining strategy for reducing oil prices quickly is opening up the Strategic Petroleum Reserve while making a major push for oil conservation. Third, I think we're going to sell off the Strategic Reserve by mid-century anyway. So why not do it now when consumers need the relief and we can use the money to help end our oil addiction? We must be honest with the public. Oil prices are headed much higher over the next 5 to 10 years unless we jumpstart the transition to low-cost alternative fuels, something even oilman T. Boone Pickens has said. Some insist that more offshore drilling will lower prices, but that is the one strategy we know has failed. We tried opening up most of the Gulf of Mexico to offshore drilling 2 years ago, but oil prices have doubled since then. Ending the moratorium on coastal drilling, where there is maybe 1/5 the oil already available for drilling in the Gulf, offers no realistic hope for reducing oil prices. Indeed, the Bush administration's own energy experts have made the same point. But selling a relatively modest amount of crude oil from the Strategic Reserve while promoting oil conservation could pop the speculative bubble and lower oil prices. It worked very well when President Bush's father did it during Desert Storm, as you heard from Kyle, and as my chart in the testimony shows. Hopefully someone will flip that chart over there. As Kyle said, the President merely announced that he would sell 34 million barrels. And as you could see, oil that had started to spike up in price immediately collapsed, and it was about a 1/3 drop over the course of a day or two. So imagine what would happen if the current President Bush announced today he was going to sell 3 times as much oil, 90 million barrels, over the next 6 months at the rate of 500,000 barrels a day. I advocate combining that sale with a strong push for oil conservation. This president, or more realistically the next president, should use his bully pulpit to launch a national oil conservation education campaign urging consumers and businesses to take a variety of steps to reduce gasoline use. That could easily double the oil provided by the Strategic Reserve. Now, if oil prices did drop as a result of these actions, as I expect, then obviously that would vindicate this strategy. But if oil prices did not drop, that would merely demonstrate how useless the Strategic Reserve was in the first place. I try to make this point in my testimony. The Strategic Reserve is not strategic. It was created at a time when people worried that countries could withhold oil from us. But now we have a global market, so that isn't possible. We have replaced the possibility of oil shortages with the reality of rising prices. So if we don't use the Strategic Reserve to deal with our current price spike, when would we ever use it? Indeed, I've asked people all the time, name me a scenario in which we would use the Strategic Reserve, any significant fraction of it. After all, in the entire 3-decade history of the Strategic Reserve, a mere 32 million barrels were sold during crises. And we now have 700 million barrels. So we're not, and I think we're not going to keep this relatively useless reserve for many more decades. As you know better than anyone, Mr. Chairman, we need to be almost completely off of oil by mid-century to avoid catastrophic global warming. So sometime soon we're going to sell off the Spro's oil, because I can't imagine the taxpayers and their representatives are going to seriously sit on $100 billion sitting under the mattress forever. It's not going to happen. We're going to sell it off, so why not do it now when we can use the price relief, and we could generate tens of billions of dollars this year and in coming years. Some of that could help low-income families deal with high energy bills, and some could jumpstart the transition to a clean energy economy and end our oil addiction. Gasoline prices are headed much, much higher unless we begin an aggressive switch to the only domestic alternative fuel that is both abundant and much cheaper than gasoline, namely electricity. We need to start spending billions of dollars accelerating the deployment of plug-in hybrids, energy efficiency, recycled energy, wind power, solar photovoltaics, and solar baseload. In conclusion, some argue that oil prices will drop if we end the federal moratorium on coastal drilling, even though that would only deliver maybe 100,000 barrels of oil a day sometime after 2020. And I just don't understand how anyone can believe in more coastal drilling and oppose releasing 500,000 barrels of oil a day starting now. Of course, the first strategy would benefit oil companies, and the second strategy would benefit the American people, so that may explain who supports what. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rome. And our final witness is Mr. Jim May. Mr. May is the President and CEO of the Air Transport Association, the nation's oldest and largest airline trade association. Mr. May has been with ATA since 2003. We welcome you, sir. Whenever you are ready, please begin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would note that one of the first things I did within 2 weeks of joining ATA in 2003 was to ask for a release from the SPRO, where they're publicly before the Senate Energy Committee. So there is a little bit of precedent to our position. First, thank you and the other members of Congress and the committee for your leadership in assuring that we do not continue to fill the SPRO at these extraordinary prices. I don't have to convince you that high oil prices are smothering our nation's families, taking an especially heavy toll on aviation, but also trucking and agriculture and hospitality industry and other key sectors that help drive the U.S. economy. This morning, oil was trading at about $126 and change versus $75 a year ago. That's well over $4 a barrel for American families. I would also note for you that due to limited refining capacity and global demand, jet fuel, Jet A, which we burn, costs as much as $30 a barrel more than gasoline. So we've been paying upwards of $170 a barrel, which is significantly greater than in 2007. In fact, we're going to spend $62 billion as an industry domestically this year on fuel. That's about $20 billion more and accounts for the $10 billion we're projected to lose in this calendar year. To give you a perspective on a per-consumer basis, we're spending today about 7 cents per mile for each of the passengers that we carry. That's a fuel bill of about $420 per person, and when you consider that our average round-trip ticket across all classes and all distances is probably in the range of $400 to $500, you begin to get an appreciation for how difficult an equation we're trying to deal with. And deal with it we are, but not in happy ways. We've cut 32,000 jobs. Over 100 communities have lost service or will lose service. And it is having a devastating effect on the economy. There are a lot of reasons. We've talked about them this morning. The weak dollar, increasing demand in developing economies, insufficient exploration and refining capacity, geopolitical instability, and all of those things. I would suggest to you that there are also a number of solutions. In no particular order, increasing domestic supply, conservation, alternative fuels is critical to the future. Reining in unchecked speculation, a subject that we've become well known for talking about for some period of time, is critical. And I think a third component, the third leg of that stool, if you will, is a release from the strategic reserve. Now, increasing our domestic supplies will reduce our dependence on foreign oil, help lower prices. I think a release from the SPRO is a good first step. We have 706 million barrels. It's over 97% full. We suggest, as the Speaker has, that a 10% release, which is roughly 70 million barrels, would make a very marked increase. You've heard the testimony this morning about pricing. When President Bush did it back during Desert Storm, it was about a 38% drop. I would suggest a framework for that release. One, if it's going to be released, don't let people know in advance. Don't let the markets know in advance. Just do it on a timed basis. Two, make sure it's light sweet crude, not sour, that's being released. Three, restore U.S. commercial inventories. They're down about 58 to 60 million barrels, and that roughly equates to the 10% that we're suggesting. And finally, two things. Dedicate the revenue, as has been suggested this morning, to development of alternative fuels. We're working on biofuels projects for aviation use, for example, and set up a framework for continuing to do this as conditions dictate. Triggers, targets, something of that sort that would be worthwhile. So as I said, we think the Speaker's proposal on a 10% release would be appropriate and positive. I would also note that there is another reserve. It's the New England heating oil reserve, which could be worthy of consideration for a release and then a refill before the winter comes. And finally, Mr. Chairman, let me reiterate what I started with. We think this is a three-legged stool. We think that rather than engaging in an exercise in who's to blame for high fuel prices, Congress ought to immediately embark on a program of how we can share credit for solving the high fuel prices. We need more supply. The Republicans introduced a package yesterday that many in the majority party won't like, but I think it is absolutely worth consideration. Two, I think, as I've said before, the Speaker's plan on releasing from the SPRO. And three, Mr. Stupak's Pump Act, which I think does a terrific job of trying to attack rampant speculation in the marketplace. We need all three and any other solution. We've got thousands of people out of work, more are coming, more communities are going to lose service, and we need the Congress to address this before the August recess, if at all possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. May, very much. And now we'll turn to questions from the committee members. Mr. May, one of the arguments that is made about the deployment of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve is that we're not in an emergency. What does the airline industry have as a response to that assertion?
Mr. Chairman, I think there are at least 32,000 families who have had a breadwinner that's lost a job in my industry that would suggest this is absolutely an emergency. I would suggest all of those communities that are losing service, the people who can't move as efficiently and rapidly around the country, would suggest this is an emergency. I support the continued use of the SPRO. I think from a strategic, tactical perspective it's important. But I think there are also times when it ought to be used to address the economic emergency that exists in this country. And so I would suggest to you there is ample reason to have a controlled release.
Mr. Rome, Mr. Simpson, you both worked at the Department of Energy. Does the economic condition that we are now being confronted with qualify under the law as a situation where the President could deploy the Strategic Petroleum Reserve? Mr. Simpson?
Under the law, the definition of is really somewhat vague. It can be interpreted in many different ways. There is a strong reluctance to use economic concerns. But the definition of an emergency as a result of inadequate supplies can be fairly broad. And the flexibility that the Secretary has to do emergency or test drawdowns, test sales, different types of things is fairly discretionary. So if Mr. May's definition of an emergency is people losing jobs, I think that could be part of the definition.
Do you agree with that, Mr. Rome?
Absolutely. I would also add that if you had described current conditions today to us in the Clinton administration and said, would you release the SPRO now, I think everybody absolutely would have. I mean, we debated it under a situation that was far more mild than it is today.
Mr. Simpson, what are the if any, operational obstacles to the deployment of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve in the short run?
I don't think there are any operational obstacles to releasing it. The implications of an exchange that I talked about would be actually positive in the long term for the reserve, because we would begin to make the capacity of the oil in the reserve more reflect the 40% of the refining industry's use of heavy oil. I think we're in jeopardy here. We've got a hurricane coming in and down in Texas. If it had turned south and gone into Mexico and disrupted some of the heavy oil production down there, we wouldn't have a way to replace that heavy oil using the Strategic Petroleum Reserve.
So you're saying releasing light crude now and replacing it with heavy crude is something which is consistent with industry practices and needs?
Very much so.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Rome, we've already seen a disruption of heavy oil imports from Latin America under Hugo Chavez's regime in 2002. Both GAO and the Department of Energy have concluded that including some amount of heavy oil in the SPR would be wise. Do you agree with that conclusion, Mr. May, that Mr. Simpson just reached?
I'm not sure I followed the question, Mr. Chairman. Do I agree with which statement?
The statement that Mr. Simpson just made, that having more heavy crude would actually be something that could...
Yeah, I'm not an expert on heavy versus light. I can tell you this, that to the extent you're releasing light, you're making it available to all of the refineries in the United States. There are a number of refineries that cannot process heavy sour. And so replacing that with heavy sour is a perfectly sound strategy, and releasing light sweet will have the most immediate impact on the refineries all being able to use it, and for the consumer to get gasoline, Jet A, diesel fuel, etc.
Okay, now, let me just conclude by asking this question of each of you quickly. If we did pass legislation which said to the President, deploy 10% of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve over the next 5 or 6 months without telling him which day of the week to do it, but if there was something happening in Iran or Nigeria, other parts of the world, he could deploy 1 million barrels of oil on the couple of days before or after that incident, and maybe not deploy anything for a week or so after that. Would that have, in your opinion, a downward pressure on the price of oil if the President had that authority and had to deploy 70 million barrels over a 5 or 6 month period? Mr. Simpson.
I believe it would, and in looking at the history, I think that's the case. If you add the government as a player, and there are people who advocate both sides, but if you put the government in as a player, it makes it more difficult to accurately predict, as speculators would like to do, what the oil price would be in the future. Dr.
Rome?
I would agree with that. I mean, obviously it assumes that the President would make use of that authority. But if the President were willing to make use of the authority, I don't think it would have any question that it would have a downward pressure on prices.
Mr. May?
It would have a downward pressure.
Okay, thank you. My time has expired. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Schreck.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Simpson, I want to begin with you to ask some questions about your knowledge of prior drawdowns. In your testimony, how many drawdowns did you cover or in your analysis?
4.
4. In each of those instances, prices fell?
Yes.
Can you tell me what the percentage reduction was each time of the overall SPRO? 5%, 30%, 50%?
It was not, I'd have to go back and look at the math, but it was in the range, let's say they offered 34 million barrels in 1991, and we had about, I think about nearly 600 million barrels in the reserve at that time. So it would have been a 5% reduction.
Do you recall if any of them were more than the 10%, which Mr. May has expressed support for?
No, they have not been.
Okay. You said that the current law is vague, and the vagueness goes to the issue of whether it's supposed to be used for a military emergency, I take it, versus an economic situation like we face now. Is that right?
Actually, it's usually viewed as a supply disruption. It's been used in 91 it was a military, in 2005 it was a hurricane.
Mr. Rome testified that he could see no circumstance under which our supply of foreign oil could be cut off. A closing of, apparently not the closing of the Straits of Hormuz, nor a war with Iraq, nor a war with whoever in the Middle East, that under no circumstance, because we have a world market, that our supply would be either cut off or dramatically reduced. At least that's what I understood him to say. I'll ask him in just a moment. Would you agree with that?
There are circumstances where the global supply could be diminished, where a circumstance where U.S. supply could be cut off, I don't think exists.
Right. It could be reduced, but not cut off.
Right.
Presumably. Is there a safe, in your mind, or an unsafe level of drawdown that we could do? 10% would be safe given what might happen to us that we don't anticipate versus 90% might be unsafe, or do you think it doesn't matter?
I think the way the reserve is put together, that if you talk about a 10% reduction, and if some of the proposals that I've heard, we would never actually be 10% short. If you look at the reserve, and just pick West Hackberry or Bryan Mound, they're comprised of many different caverns. And so you could draw one cavern down, draw another one down, then begin to replenish it as market conditions play.
I need to get to Mr. Rahm. Mr. Rahm, did I misstate your position?
Well, I
thought I heard you say, as a matter of fact, I took notes, that there just is no circumstance under which we would need to draw it greater than now. And I presume that means even a war, or even a cutting off of the Straits of Hormuz.
Well, what I tried to say was I asked people to describe me the scenario. I have never heard a plausible scenario. I mean, if you shut down the Straits of Hormuz, I mean, I guess it would depend on the circumstances, but obviously the price of oil would skyrocket immediately, and I'm not certain the Strategic Petroleum Reserve would have any impact. I mean, but in 30 years, we've never released more than 30 million barrels, so it's very hard to say sometime in the near future we're going to need 500 million barrels to release. It's just there's no historical evidence that any circumstance like that would ever happen.
Mr. May, as I understand your testimony, it's essentially all of the above. At least a three-legged stool. We need to be doing everything we can.
That is correct. We support the continued existence of the SPRO, but we think a 10% drawdown would be positive economic news. We think that supply side has to be part of the equation. You and I have talked about that many times in the past, and we think that there has to be a strong, credible, no-nonsense approach to speculation in the marketplace, and think that Mr. Stupak's bill does a terrific job of addressing that.
You did, 2 quick points, and then I want to have a follow-up question, Mr. May. You did note that the price of oil dropped $16 roughly following the President's announcement. That
yes, sir. It's all due to ATA's efforts on speculation.
Congratulations. Appreciate that. I don't really care what, I'm with you, I don't care what the cause is. I don't
either. I just, and I want to give everybody credit. I don't want any for us. I just want to get the prices down.
I like the idea. Let me ask you for one more piece of advice. Let's say that we pass legislation now directing, say, a 10% reduction in the SPRO, and we also pass the Pump Act. Mr. Stupak had a witness at his hearing who I believe has advised your industry, who said that if the Pump Act were to pass, his testimony was the price of oil would drop by 50% in 30 days. Mr. Stupak himself, being somewhat more humble and afraid that might not be true, on the floor last week said that he believed that the Pump Act were to be passed and signed into law. And for the purpose of my question, let's assume it is. So we do the SPRO and we do the Pump Act. Mr. Stupak said the price of oil would drop by 30% in 30 days. My question of you is, let's assume we do both of those before the August break to help the American people. And let's assume that, let's give Mr. Stupak and the SPRO time to work. Let's say 45 days from now, the price of oil is not down at all. What would you then suggest we do?
Mr. Shattuck, at that point, first of all, I very strongly believe that if you do both of those things, it will have a huge impact, downward impact on prices. If, God forbid, it doesn't, then I think you've got to go the supply side, even though it may have a minimal short-term effect, and there is going to be some short-term effect as well as long-term. I'm not smart enough to know beyond that what else there is to do.
Do you buy the 30 to 50% figure?
I don't know that I
days?
buy 30 to 50%, but what I do buy is most of the experts suggesting that the normalized cost of production, which is the fancy term for what should oil sell for today in a real world market, supply and demand being what it is, China, India, dollar, et cetera, is probably about 75 to 80 bucks a barrel. And if it's trading at 126 this morning, then we've got a long way to go to get there.
Thank you.
Great. The gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentlelady from California, Ms. Solis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question is for Dr. Rahm. You know, when I go back to my district, people say, well, why do we not have more supply available and why are we not drilling? What would your response be to average person on the street about what that means? I mean, clearly we have to articulate that what you said earlier about drilling, that those supplies won't be made available for another 20 years. What are some good things that we could be telling our constituents about the reality of what's really happening out there?
Well, I think people need to understand that it is, you know, it took us 2 or 3 decades to get into this mess. Certainly many of us have been urging for quite some time that we need a much more aggressive strategy on fuel efficiency and alternative fuels. I'm not certain that's a lot of comfort to your constituents. I certainly would tell them that in 2006, Congress opened up most of the Gulf of Mexico to drilling. And according to the Energy Information Administration, the Bush administration's own EIA, there's about 41 billion barrels there. And we've found about 7 billion in the last 2 years. Now the coastal drilling, I don't know what else to call it, because I think the public is confused. They think we're not drilling offshore. We are doing a lot of drilling and exploring offshore. According to the EIA, there's about 18 billion barrels. Which is a lot less than what's in the Gulf. And it should be pointed out that of the 18 billion that the moratorium applies to, 10 billion is off of California. And I think if we left it up to the state of California, we wouldn't be doing any drilling. So we're not talking about much oil, and I think the notion that if we opened up 40 billion barrels in 2006 to be drilled, and since then oil prices have doubled, the possibility that if you ended the moratorium to a lot less oil, anything would happen to oil prices is absurd. And I think it is incumbent upon political leaders like yourself to just give the public straight talk. I understand that the higher oil prices are, the more people believe, hey, we should drill more. We are drilling flat out. We have been, and I'm sure you have the statistics, the Congress, the White House has been opening up land onshore and offshore for drilling.
I wanted to change the subject a little bit. We talk about gearing up for renewable energy and new technologies. We had a bill signed into law by the President last year, our energy bill that included the Green Jobs Act. Can you give me some insight there about how this plays into getting our dependency off of fossil fuels and what that means? And maybe also Mr. May could talk a little bit about that too, because of your industry and how you are driven and how this transition may impact your area. So very quickly.
Sure. Well, I think it's very clear. This year, we're going to send $700 billion. American consumers are going to spend $700 billion overseas to purchase oil. And as T. Boone has said, there's no prospect that that number is going to be lower for the next 10 years. That's going to be $7 trillion. Obviously, it would make a great deal of sense to spend money in this country on plug-in hybrids, wind power, solar photovoltaics, energy efficiency, and keep the money in America paying people to do insulation, to build better cars, etc., than to send trillions of dollars overseas. So that is
the criticism we get, though, if I could just quickly say, is that we're actually going to decrease the number of jobs here at home. So that's an argument that is being used by the other side of the aisle against us now, that if we reinvest, it's going to take away from those jobs that currently exist.
Well, we're importing almost, about 2/3 of our oil. So $700 billion out of, let's say, $1 trillion we're going to spend on oil this year is just going to go to Saudi Arabia, it's just going to go to Venezuela, it's going to go to Russia, it's going to create jobs in those countries. I don't see how that $700 billion can do anything for Americans. If we could spend a couple $1 trillion over the next 10 or 20 years, invest in this country, and then reduce that from $700 billion to a couple $100 billion, we'd be bringing back a $500 billion each year, keeping it in this country. I just think it makes obvious sense that that is the way to economic health and well-being.
Mr. May, just quickly, I know my time's run out.
I think that two quick points to make. Number one, the aviation space, the aviation sector feels that being environmentally sound is in its own best interest for one very simple reason. We are totally carbon intensive right now in terms of our fuel, and so the less we burn, the more environmentally friendly we're going to be, and we are desperate to spend less money on fuel in whatever way we can. Next generation air traffic control, winglets, we can go down a long list of things that we're working on.
I'd love to hear more about what that cost would mean or investment that would be made.
We'll be happy to provide that to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, gentlelady's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. McNerney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I'm sorry, excuse me. The chair recognizes.
Yeah, I thought the gentleman from Oregon had.
I'm sorry, excuse me. The gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Blumenauer, excuse me.
Thank you. Well, I wanted to follow up on Ms. Solis' point because it seems to me that saving $250 billion, $500 billion, reinvesting it here, helping the United States move from a position where we waste more energy than any country in the world to being ready for the next generation of generation. And I wanted to start, Mr. May, just if we were to have 10, 20, 30, $40 billion over the course of the next 5 years that we can accelerate investments in helping industries like yours reduce your carbon footprint.
Sure.
What impact could that potentially make if there's an extra, say, $10 billion available to subsidize a new generation of aircraft, retiring the elements of the fleet that may not be necessary because of changing configurations of the market? What?
Well, Congressman, the reality is we're in an economic crisis. We're going to lose $10 billion this year. That's $10 billion we're not going to invest in new Boeing aircraft, for instance, or a number of other changes. So, trying to figure out what sort of national investment needs to be made, I think, should be a high priority. And it ranges from more money going into the development of biofuels, biomass. Boeing has a project they debuted at the Farnborough Air Show just this last week, to environmentally sensitive CTL, to a whole range of different technologies. Next generation air traffic control can save us billions and billions of dollars and hundreds of millions of metric tons of CO2.
In the course of a plane trip, is the takeoff and the landing the most energy-intensive part of the trip?
I'm going to guess it is, Congressman Blumenauer, but I'm not sufficiently expert to answer that without doubt. I can get an answer for you.
I would appreciate your information, your reference that it's costing 7 cents per passenger mile
for fuel today.
I am interested in how that varies in terms of trip distance.
That figure is an average figure across all, but I'll get you the detail.
Great. Thank you very much. I am interested in this notion about a sustained drawdown for a while. If we don't need 706 million barrels of oil, and I think I'm not quite where you are yet, Dr. Ohm, but I do think there's strong evidence that we could get by with hundreds of millions of barrels less, that were transitioned into the fuel supply system so that there is something that's sustainable over the next 2 or 3 years. And concurrently, the revenue that is generated from that would be available to help the transition of technologies, to bump this up, that it would be sort of a double benefit. I mean, I still am stunned that a 2% world increase in demand has, over the course of the last year, we've seen prices double. There is something going on in terms of speculation and market manipulation, it seems to me, without question. But using the SPRO and a significant amount of it for reinvestment as a longer-term strategy so that we have a 3 to 5 year bridge that we can make a difference. I'm wondering if you would care to comment on that notion.
Sure. Well, we could sell 500,000 barrels of oil a day for 4 years and run through the entire SPRO. So you can sort of decide for yourself how much of the SPRO you think we need. It's hard for me to believe we need even half of the current SPRO. Again, if the SPRO were half as big as it is now, it would still be 10 times the size of the amount of oil we've ever released during crises. So, you know, running 500,000 barrels of oil a day for 2 years obviously would have an impact on prices and would generate a lot of revenue to jumpstart the clean energy transition. But you can ask Kyle's opinion.
Yeah, I disagree somewhat with Joe. I do think we need to have a strong, robust strategic petroleum reserve. I do, however, think we ought to use it. It seems silly to have an investment of that magnitude in the ground and not be willing to use it for things like helping to pay for the transition, the R&D that we need for the next generation of clean energy technology.
But just, would you feel comfortable if we were making a strategic allocation of 100 to 200 million barrels over the next 2 to 5 years as we're trying to work this through? Is that something that's within your comfort level, absent some other development?
I don't know that I would go that big. I like the idea of this exchange.
Okay.
I think the exchange works. What we suggested in testimony, Congressman, is that you set up a framework for how it would be used. You may set target prices, fill below a certain level, as Congress has already directed, release above a certain price level. Use it as a safety mechanism to balance out what's going on.
Thank you very much.
Great.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Great. Gentleman's time has expired. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. McNerney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Rahm, I was actually quite, I don't say startled, but surprised by your prediction that the SPR would be gone by mid-century. My personal feeling, I think, lies more with Mr. Simpson. We ought to keep that around for the kind of purpose that we need it for today, to keep the market speculation in check. And you've shown with your testimony that, geez, that's been done a couple of times in the past. It works. Why don't we keep some of this stuff around just for that purpose, if nothing else? But I believe that there's a sufficient supply of oil out there today. I'm not talking about 5 years from now or 10 years from now, but there's a sufficient supply of oil out there today, and the SPR can be used to start a medium-term drop in the oil prices. Do you all agree with that? That the SPR can be used in the light of a adequate supply today to initiate a medium-term drop in prices?
I believe it can, and I think that you can, if you do it right, you can help also address the next problem, which is we need to get off of oil. So if you use the Strategic Petroleum Reserve to help keep the prices in a reasonable band, whatever that may be, and use the money that is generated to help develop the technology to move us on to the next generation, then it's serving the dual purpose.
Look, could I just say,
sure.
Imagine what happens if we don't use it now. That means we're sending a signal to the market that there is never going to be a price or economic reason we will ever release it. So that's just going to encourage the speculators, hey, they've got all this oil there, never going to use. It's just crazy, really.
Well, I see the Strategic Petroleum Reserve being used to decrease the price. I think that's going to happen maybe in the next presidency. But what I don't want to see is that since we're at importing, what, 60 to 70% of our oil, we're still a very high risk for our economy, for our future. But fortunately, we have the technology coming out today with plug-in hybrids, with all-electric vehicles that if the Fed does its job in encouraging the American consumers to become efficient, within a decade or so, we'll see most new vehicles being plug-in hybrids or all-electric, and the whole oil price issue will be a non-issue like it is today. I mean, I think that's perfectly within the realm of possibility. Do you agree with that?
I agree with half of that.
Okay.
I just think that what is happening in China and India means that if we did make this aggressive switch to plug-in hybrids, we would shield the American consumer from high oil prices. But I don't know that we would lower oil prices, because demand is just going to grow as you see the urbanization and industrialization of the developing world. My reason for advocating the transition to clean energy and plug-in hybrids is that fuel is substantially cheaper than gasoline. So if you own a plug-in hybrid, you don't care really what the price of gasoline is. I would hope if we could get China and India to transition over to electric vehicles and clean energy, then we might be able to bring the price of oil down.
Especially if we're manufacturing those items and sending them over there. But so I think we're pretty much on agreement. If we get ahead of the efficiency curve, then we're going to be insulated from the high prices that are inevitably going to come. One other question: the Strategic Petroleum Reserve is there. It's a resource for us. Is there a specific legislation that any one of you would recommend in terms of how we would legislate using that in the future?
There is a piece of legislation, H.R. 6067, that was introduced by Congressman Lamson and co-sponsored by the chairman and others on the committee that would would cause an exchange and then would reinvest any revenue that was gained as a result of the price differential between light and heavy crude to be invested in energy R&D across the board. That's been authorized by the Congress, but the money's not been available to fully fund those programs.
Thank you. I'm going to yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Hall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. May, it's good to see you again, sir, and I'm interested to see that that ATA considers this an emergency. My constituents consider this current situation an emergency. In New York's 19th district, I'm hearing from people who can't afford the gas to drive to a job interview. I'm hearing from school districts who are wondering how they're going to power their buses and whether they'll be able to or whether they'll be required to reduce the number of bus runs by cramming kindergartners on the same bus with high schoolers to save on diesel fuel. I'm hearing from families that are having to choose between a third meal in a day and gasoline. So as badly as the Gulf Coast was hit during Katrina, and not to diminish by any means the suffering that they are still going through down there in the recovery, the attempted recovery from Hurricanes Katrina and Rita, nonetheless, the impression we have in New York, in the 19th District anyway, and that I hear from others around the country, is that as a whole, our economy is suffering more today than it was during and after Hurricane Katrina. The impact that is being had by the increase in gas prices on the economy across the board, whether it's aircraft, cost of goods that it's being increased, difficulty in the tourism industry or the trucking industry, or go on down the list, is more widespread and more pervasive and more of a crisis than it was when we were hit by those two hurricanes in a row. So I would make the argument that this is a crisis and that there should be a release. I'm happy to hear all of you saying that, and I guess the question is how much, over what period of time. And I totally agree that using the benefit, we actually stand to, for the first time maybe ever, have the taxpayer sell something that it bought earlier and make a profit at it. Most of the oil there, I would guess we bought it less than $50 a barrel.
About 30.
About average around 30. So if we sell it at 120, 130, whatever it may be, it may come down a little bit once this starts to be known. it'll nonetheless be at least double what we paid for it. And it is, as Mr. Simpson has said, an opportunity for us to use this profit, whether it's a swap or an outright sale, to bring renewable fuels and alternative fuels to market and start to get ourselves an alternative, a competitor for oil. Last night, T. Boone Pickens spoke to our caucus. I understand he also spoke to the Republican caucus as well. And he has a very interesting plan that he's heavily investing in himself, which is to use the wind belt up the central part of the country from Texas to the Dakotas and somewhat to each side, and both coasts as well, to produce enough electricity that we can replace the natural gas that's currently being used for power generation, so that can be diverted to transportation. And that much less liquid fuel used in our cars and trucks will mean more that can be used by the aviation industry, and so on. I think that I see in my district, I've helped to build with work gloves and a hard hat on down in the trench, helped to put in geothermal systems that will cut air conditioning costs to practically zero and cut heating costs in the winter in our latitude to about 50% of what they currently are. I could go on and on. You know the story between the air, the solar, the wind, the geothermal, the tidal power, and so on. So the alternatives are there. I want to ask a question which will probably use up the rest of my time. Many of my constituents are already being asked to make lock-in purchase agreements for home heating oil for this coming winter and are experiencing some serious sticker shock, looking at $5 heating oil, whereas last year it was $2 and something. So how could a release from the SPR best help to take the edge off of home heating oil prices in addition to gasoline? And I would ask you, starting with Mr. Simpson, if you could each answer that, please.
Well, I think you could go back to the exchange that occurred in 2000, and it was precipitated by a concern about heating oil. It was a physical shortage of heating oil that they were concerned about at that time. But if you could release oil, have it refined into heating oil, and it's the price of the oil that's going to drive the cost of the heating oil. So if you can put enough into the market that it does stop some of the speculation and allows the price to get back to what many have suggested is a much lower price under the fundamentals, there's time to do that before the winter heating season.
Thank you.
Well, I would just say, if we released 500,000 barrels of oil a day for, let's say, 6 months, that should drop the price substantially. And that would obviously benefit people who drive cars, who fly planes, and who have to heat their homes with oil. If it didn't reduce the price of oil substantially, that would tell us something very important, which is that we are in a very big, long-term supply-demand mismatch, and we had better work really hard to do what T. Boone says. So I think I just think that we should find out how much speculation, how much froth there is in the market versus how much the price is actual supply-demand trends, and releasing a fair chunk of oil from the SPRO would tell us that very quickly.
Mr. May?
Mr. Hall, I noted at the outset of my testimony that this is not an issue that simply affects airlines or truckers or agriculture or retail or the hospitality industry, but consumers everywhere. And I think anything this Congress does, and I've recommended 3 legs to that stool, anything you do to bring prices down is going to have a sweeping effect across the whole economy. And I think it will impact the constituents in Poughkeepsie who are worried about home heating oil for the winter, as it would in Wisconsin or any place else where it's particularly cold. And it's going to make a difference for transportation. It's going to make a difference for the hotel and lodging industry that is having such a tough time because we're cutting back on the number of flights going to a lot of these different destinations. So I think the sooner the better, the more widespread, the more sweeping the relief that Congress can provide, the better.
Thank you.
Okay. Mr. Sensenbrenner?
Thank Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Technology has failed with microphones on the Republican side. I guess I should say I'm not surprised. But that being said, let me say that release of crude oil from the SPRO is going to be temporary at best, and it will cool the futures market. There's no question about that. But if Dr. Rahm's fear is right, that there is something more to this than speculation and a bubble that has been created, it seems to me that everybody's going to have to step back and look at what to do. And we've heard an awful lot of opposition led by the Speaker of the House on the other side of the aisle against drilling anywhere. And I would hope that if there is a release from the SPRO and nothing happens relative to immediate relief that is significant enough to make a dent in the economy for the better, then it's my hope that my friends over on the other side of the aisle will realize that drilling is at least a part of the answer. I think that we on our side of the aisle, most of us at least, myself included, know that drilling is not the exclusive answer, but we think it should be a part of the answer, and they don't. So the only observation that I would make is I think that releasing oil from the SPRO is worth a try. But if it doesn't work, then we've got to do something more fundamental, and we ought to do it in September before this Congress adjourns sine die. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Cleaver?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Pickens, T-Bone Pickens, suggests that unless we reduce our dependence on foreign oil, that a barrel of oil could rise to $300 a barrel. Is that an exaggeration, or do any of you see that as the next normal?
Well, let me say, I don't think there's any question that if we don't get off of our current path on oil prices are headed much higher. And the CIBC actually projects $200 a barrel of oil in 2 years. So no, I don't think, whether it's, 200, 250, 300, it's hard to say.
Yeah, over 10 years, what he said, I should have.
Right, and over 10 years, I think that's reasonable. I think it's absolutely reasonable because, after all, it looks like current prices of oil aren't destroying demand or generating huge amounts of extra supply. And demand's just going to keep going up because of China, India, and other countries. So, at some point, the price has to rise until demand is destroyed or there's a lot of more supply. One of those two things has to happen, or else prices will just keep rising.
Congressman, I'm going to take a somewhat different view. I think that my colleague is correct here in one respect. On the other hand, I think there's been great joy and sport taken in predicting $150, $200+ oil by a whole lot of folks in the trading community who are delighted to see the expectation of increasing prices become a very profitable sideline. And I'm not at all happy with that byproduct of this speculation that is assisting in the process of driving prices up. I do think there is a speculative bubble, and I happen to believe that the marginal cost of production for oil is somewhere in the $65, $75, $85 range. And that it's realistic to expect $100 oil just as easily as it is $200 oil, and that's a somewhat different view.
Mr. Cleaver, one thing, it's kind of hard to argue with Boone Pickens with as much money as he's made and the predictions that he's made. I think the price could go up or the price could go down, but the one thing that we may not have a lot of control over that, but we've got tools that we can use to keep us from having to be in this situation. there are many technological advances that are either out there to be deployed or just over the horizon, that if we can get some pressure released by trying, and I thought Joe's point was great. If we release oil from the reserve and it works to drive prices down, great. If we release oil from the reserve and it doesn't work, that's a wake-up call. Yeah. And we've got to get out of this situation, and we have the tools to do that.
What would be a reasonable test period to see whether or not the release of oil from the reserve is impactful on the economy? I mean, is it for one quarter? Should we wait a year? I mean, if it doesn't drop the prices prices at the pump, I mean, you think people are scared because of Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae? I mean, that would generate, I think, a crisis in this country. I've changed my. I used to think we had a transportation-based economy. I think we now have a confidence-based economy. You know, if the confidence of the public drops, we're in trouble. So, what period of time? I mean, I happen to support it, but I'm also at the same time frightened by the prospects of it not dropping the prices of oil.
Could I just say that one of the reasons why no one ever uses the SPRO is that it's always argued in the highest levels of the government that that will show that the government is scared and it's a crisis, and that's why they're releasing the SPRO. So they never release the SPRO for that reason. And so, as I say, I personally think the SPRO is relatively useless. I would say 3 to 6 months. If the president announced that he's going to sell 500,000 barrels a day for 3 to 6 months, and he started doing it and nothing happened, then people should panic, because that means T. Boone is probably right. And we are headed to 300 unless we really make a concerted effort to end our addiction to oil. And that, I think, would be worth knowing also.
And I would say, I think 3 to 6 months. History shows that if the announcement is made, you see the reaction. And then you begin to see it takes time to get into the gasoline markets, because it takes time to refine the product that you've already got. But I would also make an observation that I wouldn't say I'm going to release 500,000 barrels a day every day for the next 3 to 6 months. I'd say we're going to release a set amount of oil and make it 70 million barrels or 90 million barrels, and then let that uncertainty as to when that oil is going to come out will further tamp down the markets. But if you, and they might sell it all at once, but they might trickle it out and let it go at different times.
I apologize for being late. I was over at the House in another meeting. So you may have already dealt with this, but do you have any dates or times? I probably should know this. When we deployed the reserves previously, you may have already talked about it.
Sure. And in 1991, right before Desert Storm, and I will expand a little bit on what I said earlier. The President announced on January 16th that we were going to attack Iraq, and that we were going to release 34 million barrels from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. The next day, the price of oil dropped by a third, $10. I want to point out that that was not the only thing that caused that to happen. In October of the previous year, after the invasion of Kuwait had occurred, there was a test sale. The Secretary of Energy said, you know, we haven't used the Strategic Petroleum Reserve in a while. I'm not sure the companies really are aware of how to interact with us on this, so we're going to do a 4 million barrel test sale, which was a pretty good forecast that the government was going to use it. That actually helped dampen prices a bit in the fall. And then there was a coordinated effort with the International Energy Agency, our allies going into the war, that they released some oil. It was a coordinated effort. Then the President made his announcement, and the price just dropped, and they actually didn't sell the 34 million barrels. They only sold 17, but the markets stabilized. And then there's 1996, when the Congress directed the Department of Energy to sell 227 million barrels of oil to help balance the budget. It was enacted into law, signed by the President, I think, on April 26th. Prices of gasoline were rising dramatically, particularly in California. There had been a refinery fire and some other things that were a whole multitude of things coming in place. And President Clinton made an interesting decision. So it's smart to sell oil from the reserve. If you've got to raise $227 million, why not sell the oil as fast as you can while the prices are high and get value for the taxpayer back? It was a very good move. Coincidentally, the price of gasoline dropped the next day and continued to fall through October of that year. The heating oil exchange in 2000 is another example where there was a shortage. Price dropped, I think, around 30% at that time. And then after Hurricane Katrina, even though the problem after Hurricane Katrina was more of a refining capacity problem, or at least equally a refining capacity problem because the refineries got flooded out, as it was a loss of production. The fact that they released oil from announced the release of oil from the reserve caused the price to drop fairly dramatically.
Can I ask one more question? I apologize, but when we have people with your expertise here, I want to try to squeeze every drop from you. And this is, I'm asking you to be swamis almost, I guess, but if the U.S. Released from Strategic Petroleum Reserve 200 barrels or 300 barrels, whatever, a large number, and then Japan also announced that they were going to release a couple of 100,000 barrels. Do you, and our friends around the world, if we have any left, and they, I mean, do you think that would have even a greater impact, and the success in dropping the price at the pump would be a lot more significant if more than the U.S. announced a drop, that they were going to release the Strategic Petroleum Reserve in large amounts?
Well, it's worked in the past, so I would think the more oil you could put into the market, the better the result would be.
And again, I think the other impact would be is it would send a signal to the market that those reserves weren't in fact just money stuffed under a mattress that was never going to be used, but in fact we would actually use it for this very purpose. And as long as the market thinks we're never going to use it, then the speculative bubble is just going to grow.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I just wanted to ask one more question, and before I do, I wanted to, with all due respect, refute the statement by the ranking member that Democrats are against drilling. In fact, last week I believe we voted for the Drill Act that attempted to make oil companies drill on the 68 million acres in the lower 48 and some of the 20 million acres that are available in Alaska that they are sitting on and not drilling on. Coincidentally, that same day, the administration announced a sale of 2.6 million acre, lease sale of 2.6 million acres in the NPRA in Alaska, which obviously they could have done last week or last year or 5 years ago, whenever. We were not stopping them, and we are absolutely for drilling on the land that is already leased, and there's plenty of that. But the question I have here goes to refining capacity. It's my understanding that there was one application in the last 30 years in this country for a refinery. It was granted, and that refinery was never built. Is that accurate to your knowledge?
There haven't been any refineries built in the last 30 years. I think that's right.
But it's not because the applications are being denied.
It's not necessarily. It's a very complicated, obviously, process to do a green build of a refinery. It is also not true that we have less refining capacity than we have. Actually, a lot more refining capacity than we did 30 years ago. It's been expansions of existing facilities.
I just quickly, because we're over time already, but I just wanted say, my understanding is that our refineries today are running at just below 90%. Does that sound?
That sounds about right.
About right. So to be clear, given the market calming impact and supply increasing impact of a release from the SPR, there should not be any credence to arguments that a lack of refining capacity would mitigate the effect of an SPR release.
That's true, because you're releasing oil into a global, even though that oil would stay in the United States, it means there's some oil that would not then have to come in here that could go to other places, and it would have a global effect.
Thank you. Okay, I just wanted to clarify that refining capacity doesn't stand in the way of a release from the SPR having the desired effect. And I want to thank you all for your testimony and yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Hall. The acting chairman just departed. He has a bill on the floor, which makes me the acting chair and the ranking member. I'm all powerful now.
Who better?
Yeah, I mean, this is. I've been waiting for this for years. If we can, maybe close out this session by let's look at the other side of all of the things we've been talking about. There are those who would suggest that because oil is finite, that we are foolish to release the Strategic Petroleum Reserve and think that we'll drop the oil prices and that everything is going to be fine, everybody's going to be happy, divorces will be reduced, life is good again. And the truth of the matter is we are dealing with a finite substance, and that the next generation will deal with this problem unless we deal with it. There are some things happening. Consumption has dropped. Americans are grudgingly moving from the 12-cylinder cars. Amtrak ridership is up. In my community, the area transportation authorities, buses, are increasing their ridership. The big bus companies in the country are riding. In fact, some of the Amtrak lines are sold out of seats because of people making long-term plans for Thanksgiving and Christmas. I mean, they're selling out on Amtrak all the way into December. And deaths, automobile deaths are down because people are not driving. I mean, you look at a number of the indicators and you think, well, maybe Americans need to face the reality that prices at the pump are not going to go down, and our society would be better off if they didn't, because we can now start doing what we should have done. Is that too tough a philosophy? I mean, you're not going to expect any candidate to say that, but in reality, just in here where nobody is listening, what do you think?
That on?
Well, obviously, we have squandered the last 2 or 3 decades. And all the analyses show is that, cars last 20 years and behavior patterns become very ingrained. So yes, if you want to get off of our current path, you have to work really hard for 10, 15 years, like T. Boone Pickens or Vice President Gore has said. Otherwise, oil prices are headed up. I think the American public has figured that out, which is why they're buying different cars and changing their behavior. I don't view that as an argument not to sell off the SPRO. I mean, and I just repeat what I said in my testimony, one of two things will happen. Either oil prices will drop or they won't. If they drop, that's a good thing. The SPRO has worked. If they don't, then we've learned that we're in a very big problem, that in fact we're at peak oil. Or near it, which I think is actually the case, in which case it will be incumbent on Congress to take the very strong action that people have been urging to finally end our addiction to oil. So yeah, I think the American consumers need to get used to $4 oil, and it will then be 5, 6, 7, unless their representatives take pretty strong action to reverse course.
And I would just add to that, a release from the reserve is not going to be a permanent solution. It has not been in history, and it won't be again. But we're in an era now where prices are higher. It is remarkable to me the number of new energy technologies that are coming out at these, and the pace at which they're coming. And to see T. Boone Pickens come out and propose what he proposed is fairly remarkable. But I think we've been in a high price situation for a long enough time now that we're beginning to see a transition in the way American consumers think. They are buying smaller cars. They're parking the Tahoes. They're taking mass transit, improving the efficiency of their homes, which is a very useful thing. But there's no reason to put them at the mercy of those who would drive the price up higher than the market fundamentals would be. The price is not going to fall back down to a point where I think we're going to see oh, gee, that was a bad 6 months.
Congressman, at the risk of prolonging this, I think the equation is real simple. The longer you debate this, the longer you talk about it, the more people that are going to lose their jobs, the more communities that are going to lose service. It's time to have the Congress do something, and as quickly as possible, because it is a crisis.
Thank you. Thank you. We appreciate you coming, since I'm the power here, we're going to increase your honorariums for appearing before this committee. And we appreciate, I think all members will have a time to submit remarks to the chairman for records. We appreciate very much your time, and I appreciate your talent. You're very informative. I appreciate it very much, and hopefully we will act quickly. That's one of the positives we've gotten from this hearing today. Thank you very much. Meeting is adjourned.